Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Philippa Woodhill, Director of Partnerships at the Rural Leadership Foundation, and it gives me great honour and privilege to be hosting, and I'll soon hand over to the Future Farmers Network to deliver on this national webinar series. Before we kick off, I would like to acknowledge that we are each meeting on the traditional lands wherever we may meet. I myself am on Yagara Turrbal country in southeast Queensland, and I would like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and those that are walking with us into the future. This webinar forms part of the Drought Resilient Leaders program, proudly led by the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation and in partnership and collaboration with a number of other organisations. Those organisations include the National Farmers Federation, the Foundation for Rural Regional Renewal, Rural Economy Centre of Excellence, the Australian Resilience Centre, and the University of Southern Queensland. We value the ability to be able to collaborate with these organisations and know that we are stronger together in supporting each of you in the leadership contributions that you're making. The Drought Resilient Leaders program is funded by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund, and it is one of a number of initiatives within the social resilience plan, within the Future Drought Plan. A little bit of participant housekeeping. Thank you for joining us. If you could please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us which country or where in the country it is that you're zooming in from in the chat box. That would be great for us all to understand who's there, because we actually can't see you. The recording will be available on YouTube in the next 24 hours, and we encourage you to share that with your peers and colleagues, and also to watch it again. Please add any questions that you have in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer them at this end. And certainly if we can't get to them in the webinar, we'll look to follow them up. So without further ado, it gives me great satisfaction to be working with the Future Farmers Network on this webinar. And I'd like to hand over to Amelia, who is currently Vice Chair of the Future Farmers Network and also works at Grain Growers. I won't introduce her fully. I know earlier as we were preparing, she said there's no one better to introduce yourself than yourself. So Amelia, thank you very much for being here, and over to you.
Thanks, Philippa, and g'day everyone. I hope you've got something nutritious and delicious in front of you. Thank you for joining us over your lunchtime. As Philippa said, my name is Amelia Shaw. I'm based in Sydney, or Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. And as mentioned, I have the privilege and the honour of being Future Farmers Network's Vice Chair. I also work at Grain Growers in my day job as their Policy Manager for Trade and Rural Affairs. If you're unfamiliar with FFN, as we affectionately call Future Farmer Network, our mission is to connect young people in agriculture. So if you haven't heard about us and you're not a young person, you still can be a member and be involved with the organisation. So nothing like a bit of a Google search, or jump on any of the social media channels and search us there. Thank you again for joining us today. So many great places coming in that chat, so please keep it up. Today, I'm joined by three pioneers when it comes to the tech space, with all different backgrounds and perspectives that they're bringing. Today is a casual conversation, so please ask any questions in the Q&A. But first, I'd like to introduce you to Bruce Grady, who is the Business Development Manager for Floodmaps. Floodmap is a world-first modelling solution purpose-built for flood intelligence and forecasting, which I'm sure is particularly apt given the events that have happened in Eastern Australia recently. G'day, Bruce. Thanks for joining us. Are you able to give us, I suppose, a bit of your elevator pitch as to what Floodmaps is and the solutions that it's providing?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just noticed somebody joined from Yanco. I went to Yanco Ag High about 1 million years ago. So yeah, that's a blast from the past. So my background's in disaster management. And one of the problems we always had in disaster management was knowing what the hell was actually going on in a disaster in real time. And about a year ago, I came across Floodmap, which has actually solved that problem. The two, I guess, issues that they've managed to overcome is the gift of time for people to respond in events. So knowing what's going on with time to actually do something about it. and scalability, that we can get down to a street or an asset level view of a disaster, but we can then zoom out, see the whole of state, and literally with some more money and investment in our company, we can see whole of country and get a view of what's going on. So we're sort of looking at things very much from a strategic point of view, and then down to a very tactical response, local response, whether that's by an individual or the authorities. So yeah, that's pretty much what we're looking to overcome.
Great, thanks, Bruce, and thank you for joining us. Secondly, I'm joined by John Medway, who is a Senior Research Fellow for Spatial Agriculture at the Charles Sturt University. John comes from a farming background, hailing from the Liverpool Plains in northern New South Wales, and has worked in the innovation and ag tech space for over 20 years. And oversees an incredibly interesting, vast array of projects. I think over 2,500 projects in your career, John. Are you able to give us a bit of an insight into some of those projects that you're most proud of, or things that have really shifted the dial when it comes to agriculture?
Okay, thanks, Amelia. Yeah, so I suppose my interest in spatial variability and how production in agriculture isn't a nice homogenous thing really kicked off 40 odd years ago. My first harvest without Dad on the farm, noticing that the difference impact of aphids to sorghum. It was 15 years prior to GPS and being able to do anything about it, but I sort of observed that things weren't homogenous growing in the crops. And so fast forwarding from there 20 years to working at the university, one of the when GPS and satellite imagery and a whole heap of other things came online, our first approach was very much, well, what's the soil that we're working with? How does it influence this variability? It's the landscape. It's the one thing that farmers can't necessarily influence. And I suppose we started looking at, well, how do we map soil change? And so the technologies to do that, I think is really, that's the foundation for most of the ag tech world is first thing we need to do is understand the resource that we have. And so that's really that highlight project, I think, is the use of electromagnetic induction surveying as a tool for measuring soil variability as a foundational layer for getting the most out of all the different ag tech applications that have come online since those times.
Thanks, John. Incredible background, and really look forward to having you involved in today's discussion. And finally, I'm joined by James Walker, a fellow Queenslander who hails and fifth-generation farmer from Longreach in Queensland, and also happens to be Managing Director of AgriHive. James, are you able to tell us a little bit, and our listeners particularly, what AgriHive is trying to do, particularly when looking at those crisis points in agriculture and generating action-related ideas? Sorry to do this, James. The typical, you're on mute.
All good. Thank you. Very interesting introductions, John and Bruce, and thanks, Amelia, and particularly this forum for having us on today. But particularly we started off. I tried to generate some insights for government and industry back in 2013 in the first year of drought, because I could just see how much was going wrong and how little we had to deal with it. So I had a summit in Longreach, which is sort of was for the purpose of generating ideas. I actually invited Matt Linegan back then to attend it as well. And so from that, we I suppose pulled apart a drought-affected beef enterprise in a Harvard Business case study type review, and I suppose engaged CEOs from outside of the industry to come up with some solutions. And what it came down to was financial literacy. So consequently, we had a competition for farmers, and we had, I think it was 140 entries on how they could solve that case study issue. And they were very varying and quite interesting, but it all came down to that sort of that thread, financial literacy. So I got chosen to do a leadership program over in the UK, and the dairy industry was in turmoil over there. So we had a summit there in Westminster the following year, and invited a similar sort of forum, so leaders from across agriculture and outside of it, to pull apart I suppose a price volatile affected dairy business, and same issues as in sort of financial literacy, which fed into succession, which fed into poor adoption of technology, and so people weren't really finding the impact of what was happening, of what was the possibility of adopting new technologies. So we set about, I suppose, solving that, so actioning the ideas, and we set up AgriHive, which is I suppose a holistic financial view of an agricultural enterprise, bringing in production metrics and financial metrics, fusing them together to give infographics and, I suppose, just a clear picture for all the generations to understand where the business was, and also the advisors. So it was quite an interesting journey, and and so we're still in that pursuit, but now we're trying to pull in the environmental metrics as well.
Very interesting, and look forward to seeing how you bring those environmental metrics as well. Now, we've got a broad range of speakers here, and all have very different backgrounds and insights into ag tech. But for our listeners, and probably also for all of our benefit, I love to start with a definition. And what exactly are we talking about when we say ag tech? It's generally a concept that is thrown out there as being the ability to untap and unlock potential when it comes to sustainability, uplifts in profitability, and unlocking more productivity gains. But what exactly are we talking about, and what's your perspective on ag tech? I might start with you, James.
Yeah, certainly, Amelia. Well, I think in terms of defining tech, it's technology pretty much. So it's anything you can apply to the business to improve the efficiency of it, whether it's improving the units, the units sold, so the number of units sold, so that more kilos, more head if you're in cattle or sheep, so it's the potential to improve units sold, the price received per unit sold, so actually penetrating the value chain with some of the technology, whether that technology helps you participate in, I suppose, accreditation programs, things like that. But also, and the most common and easiest one to integrate with the business is one that saves costs. So there's three sort of lenses that I look at in terms of adopting technology, and to define it, it's anything that improves the efficiencies and makes things easier for the production system. So that's how I would sort of describe it. So, for instance, I believe a mobile phone is technology adoption in agriculture, and that's quite systemic and across all systems. Everyone's got a mobile phone now with apps that they use, either voluntary or involuntary, but it's happening. So so that's probably my take on it.
Thank you. And it's a good point. I know many farmers have told me they don't necessarily look at something from the lens of ag tech, more what is it going to really make my job easier, and maybe cut some corners or make things more efficient. John, from an academic's point of view, what is ag tech from your perspective and what you teach?
From my perspective, I think ag tech is really anything that allows the collection, transmission, analysis, and use of information. And so it probably has expanded as the definition of over the last decade or so, that it isn't just about shiny things and pieces of technology as such. It's actually more about the information and communication capabilities. So ultimately, that is the critical part that we're working with, is how do we use the tools to make better decisions. And so the better decisions is what we should be focusing on, rather than what color the shiny thing is that we're using. As James said, a phone is a critical piece of technology that we all need to be using. And we don't need to be hung up on whether it's a iPhone or Android or whatever. It's just the fact that we can call people and transfer data is what we need to be working with.
Fabulous. And Bruce, from your perspective, often I suppose you probably wouldn't necessarily classify yourself as solely ag tech. You're providing solutions for, I assume, government as well. But how's your view of ag tech, particularly as someone who's not necessarily embedded in that industry?
Yeah, look, I think it's really important to understand that anything, whether it's ag or got some other prefix to it, is about solving a problem. If it doesn't solve a problem, it's a waste of everybody's time and effort. So it's really about getting the connection between a real problem and a real solution. And with technology, I think we've got two elements to always look at. There's the incremental stuff that makes our lives more efficient. So how can we take time or steps out of a process? And then there's the risky bit, and that's about disruption. That's about something that's brand new that people have actually got to think deeply about before making a decision to invest or adopt. And I think it's also important, particularly in an industry like agribusiness, is to look, and this has been mentioned before, look at the upstream and downstream. What's the impacts across the entire value chain? Because if you can't get your inputs or you can't sell your outputs as efficiently as possible, then your whole business model is going to be impacted. So I think it's a very holistic view of where technology fits into your whole value chain.
Great, thanks guys. And I suppose the common thread across all of you is that it is an ability to either have incremental change or that transformative processes, but at the end of the day, it's solving a problem on farm that ultimately makes life easier, hopefully, and doesn't necessarily impede too much or create problems as a result of its adoption as well, which I suppose leads me to my next question, which is if you're a person entering into the space of ag tech, if you're a farmer and looking at the options out there, John, you mentioned whether something is painted a particular color and whether that influences your decision to go down that path. The way I equate it is, I suppose, the Apple and Android situation. If you lock yourself into an Apple solution of the world, unfortunately, I think I'm 12 years into an Apple phone life, and I'm never going to go Android because everything is in that cloud. It's too difficult for me to figure out how to move it across. Are we seeing similar problems in the ag tech space for farmers? Is it a consideration, particularly with young farmers, when they're entering into these decisions? Should they be aware of the iOS system or the ecosystem that they're entering into for one particular solution that could then have opportunities or lock them out of opportunities in the future? John.
Yeah, certainly they need to be aware of it, but I think it is becoming less and less of an issue. That, again, 20 years ago, there were lots of proprietary systems out there, and making a decision as to which colour you chose was a real issue. But increasingly, and largely driven, I think, through farmer demand, is that the systems that are being more widely adopted are the ones that have open source or common generic platforms. And so that's really one of the first questions that anyone who's looking at any kind of technology needs to be considering is the system working on something proprietary, or is it an open standard that means that the information can be shared across multiple different systems? And then also the second consideration is really what's the support network that goes with it, because no matter what the technology is, at some point you are going to need support. And so having a really amazing piece of technology that's only supported by an internationally based remote office isn't nearly as good as a technology which might not have necessarily as many bells and whistles today, but has got a great local support network, or all your neighbours are using that technology. And so, we need, it is, as you're saying, with the 12 years of iPhone, is that these things do need to be looked at as a longer term commitment to a system and an ecosystem. And so, being open source and having local support is just critical.
James, has this been an issue that you've come across when trying to bring in data into your platforms, particularly when people might be using different software?
Yeah, I think it's the quality of the sort of the stack that you've got. So in terms of developers and programmers, they're agnostic across different platforms, and they're sort of getting more and more like that as we go. It's becoming a lot more agnostic and easy to integrate across systems. So I think that's becoming less and less an issue. I think in terms of somebody coming into the industry, traditionally and historically, I think farmers have been labelled as lacking the ability to adopt technology fast. It's a very slow. I'd probably be contrary to that and saying that farmers are a lot more astute. So they really want to see something happening and working and see and experience it themselves. And we've got a bit of a there's 3 touch points with adoption, and usually it's 3 testimonies or 3 examples of other farmers or friends or people they trust that have used the system that that will give them the confidence to uptake it. So I think I think in terms of somebody coming new, I think it's about gathering information on the different solutions and the different systems and connecting, and just like this alumni does, we're pulling apart ag technologies in this webinar, and I think that's the beauty of farming and agriculture. We've got there's in many cases a lot of similar business and production systems that we can compare solutions with. So yeah, I'd suggest don't rush out and buy something. Just make sure that you're not on the bleeding edge of technology. You're not on the cutting edge, but you're more back in the blade there. You've got the innovators that will be those testimonials for you. But yeah, there's a lot of sort of legacy systems that are being overcome now that that might actually have better solutions. So it's about ringing and asking, and and I suppose collaborating with others and communicating how they do solve those problems that Bruce was talking about.
Age-old question of word of mouth, and asking people often does pay off, I'm sure. Bruce, from your perspective, like using government integration and there, I suppose they'd have requirements around certain systems. Is it a problem that you come across, or as John said, it was an issue, say, some time ago, but has slowly progressed to open source platforms?
Yeah, look, I think one of the really critical decisions that the founders of this business made was to be technology agnostic. We can integrate with pretty much anything that can consume geospatial. As a quick example, during the recent floods, one of the energy transmitters who we've been talking to for some time suddenly decided they had actually some money to purchase our product. And it took us 33 minutes, of which 20 minutes was settling the commercials, to bring them on board and for them to start ingesting data into their systems and making operational decisions on the ground. So, I think that's a prized example or prime example of that, creating, I think the word's been used previously, around an ecosystem rather than a proprietary solution. And when you have an ecosystem, that's when you can really start to generate the value. And I think there's too many solutions out there looking for a problem. And it's really about having a problem and finding the right solution for it. So being able to pull that together in a coherent way that's accessible to the community who potentially is going to use it, I think is absolutely vital to having something that is going to prove useful over the long term.
I just want to touch on that point that you made there around lots of tech solutions out there, but not necessarily the problem. James, your face lit up there, and John, I know you and I have spoken in the past about lots of fabulous tech designers out there who can figure out a solution. But how do we, there may be solutions out there that an individual has developed, say, in a health space, but may have applications in an ag world. How do we build that relationships and ensure that people are aware of some of the solutions that we have in some of the problems that we have in ag, and that their technology may be applicable, but they're just not aware of the agricultural space? John, is there something that you've come across in some of the work that you're doing?
Not specifically, but more generically, that a lot of image processing is image processing. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at a CAT scan, an infrared picture of a plant, or a satellite image of the whole state. The software, the processing, it is all the same. And so I think a lot of the time that's where some of the ag tech needs to look outside of agriculture for some of those solutions, but also recognizing that there's actually very little that's really new, that most of these technologies and a lot of things have actually been around in a different form, but for a long time. And so ultimately someone needs to be identifying those things and bringing it to the market. It's one of those things in talking about the different technologies. The other component is we don't always have to believe all of the marketing, that when people talk about, this particular system won't talk to another particular system, that might be correct, that you can't take a John Deere file and stick it in a case harvester, but you can take a John Deere file, run it through a really simple translation, and then stick it into a case harvester. And so a lot of the time we actually need to look beyond some of the marketing material as well to, again, reach out to those networks of existing users, neighbours, other local advisors who have got experience with those sorts of things to help make sense of it.
I suppose we're a community that's got 6 generations in it now, and typically in farming, there's multiple generations on the farm at one time. When looking, I suppose, particularly at younger growers and farmers, how do you get that conversation started where you've got the balance of a technology solution and the expectations of what it's going to deliver, and then a mix of a generation that might not necessarily have the digital knowledge or nous to understand how you apply it? And then I suppose the third part is the financial outlay of that investment, either upfront or long term. James, how are farmers justifying those investments into ag tech? Is there a simple concept that people run through their head, or is it ongoing conversations with those different business partners in a farming enterprise?
Yeah, so Amelia, I sort of think that in terms of adopting new technology, there's always the flash things that some farmers pick up, like drones, and there's applications for drones, but comprehensively, every second farm had a drone for a while, and so there's things that are just fun, and I don't think we should discount that people shouldn't have things that are just fun, and improves the lifestyle. I think what the most successful, I suppose, pursuit of a sale or adoption has been considerable market research into whatever solution they're providing and what problem they've actually got. So so that comes from I suppose the founders and the business developers in that particular business, and then a really good way of doing it is actually doing cost benefit analysis for the actual user. So I know there's some water monitoring technologies that really highlight exactly the impact for that individual, depending on the kilometers they travel to troughs and tanks and things like that. So I think if you can really sort of highlight it very easily for the user on the impact and the solution that you're providing, I think it's quite good. I think it's quite interesting, in terms of there's a lot of solutions looking for a problem in ag, and one experience I had was I asked a guy in the UK once, and he was chairman of the EU Parliament. He had so many credentials, a bloke called Lord Henry Plum, and he unfortunately passed away last week, but I was in the Farmers Club over there with him, and I said, Henry, why is innovation, technology, and research so removed from agriculture, and why is there no adoption? And he went with his story, and he said, well, his son was an agronomist down the Congo, and he went down to visit, and he saw that the tribe that his son was trying to sort of improve the farming techniques with were beside a river. So he thought, all right, well, I'll take a fishing rod and a lure down, and and a few of them, and present them to the tribe and show them how to fish. And and he went on to say that when he got there, he sort of found the tribe elder and sort of showed him what he had, and proceeded to demonstrate what the fishing rod could do. So he cast it out, and after 10 minutes, he caught a fish, and a considerable sized fish, and gave it to the elder, and all the tribespeople were around, sort of looking in bewilderment. And then he caught another one about sort of 10 minutes later, and then the tribe elder realized what he was doing and said, all right, and he sort of shouted out these commands, and all the tribesmen went into the forest and started stripping bark off these big trees, and they waded out into this river, and in opposing lines started shuffling the bark shoulder to shoulder, and the lines started to come together, through 50 meters to 20 to 10, and they formed an arc, and started coming towards the bank where Henry and the tribe and his son was. And as they got close to the bank, fish started bobbling up out of the space that they'd created, and the village people ran in and started shoveling fish out of this entrapment. And anyway, the haul, and I got him to write it down because it's such a great story. There was about sort of 53 fish, all the size that Henry caught and above, and they'd done that in about sort of 12 minutes. So so that's how he answered, you know, why it isn't. And it's because I don't think we're connecting enough with the farmers on ground and really trialing and commercially proving up, you know, what the solution is. We're just we're just sort of, I suppose, preempting what the solutions and problems are. So yeah, so it was quite an interesting exchange, and you know, that's something that we take in our business. We've done, you know, over 300 sort of reviews of what we do, and so it's really, I suppose, fueling what we do and what we build, and we've always got that in mind.
That's a great story, James, and thank you for sharing that. It's one that quite often many growers have come to me and indicated that they want to be involved and quite often have an interest. And as someone has noted in the chat there's obviously deficiencies when some of the internet provided and data uploads are an issue. But for all the panelists, how are some of the ways that farmers can be more engaged, or if they've got an interest, are there ways that they can connect with digital providers, or is it just through trial and conversation to really get connected and looking at those opportunities?
Is that for me, Amelia?
For all the panelists, I suppose. Is there something that farmers should be doing? And John, you're obviously not, Bruce, you're not necessarily explicitly in this space, but there's some ways that we can connect with farmers a bit more from a tech side.
I might just sort of go first. In terms of what we do, Amelia, our farm, we've turned into sort of a research precinct. So anyone that wants to research a solution and validate it, you know, we're happy to work with them. We've defaulted to working with universities mainly. So so that's been quite great. And we just concentrate, I suppose, on, the journey. So, you know, there might not be a direct solution that we're finding in the research papers, but the unintended consequences of actually conducting research and finding secondary effects of the technologies is quite interesting. So we're always open to that and always looking to do something, paid or unpaid. You know, I just think it's sort of an obligation of farmers to contribute, and you know, I'd implore this leadership group to look for ways that they can stimulate better and faster research outcomes.
I'll probably jump in and add to that, James, that there's certainly an increasing number of opportunities for producers to learn about the technology, and whether that's reaching out to their local farming systems group or land management group, local universities, all kinds of organisations now are starting to realise just that the issues that we have, that there's not a great deal of digital literacy across the whole industry, and it's not just producers, it's within the whole value chain. And so that's one of the major impediments to adopting this technology, is how do we address that shortcoming. One of the other things, sort of going back to the previous question about sort of intergenerational changes and discussions, I think one of the important aspects to that is actually forgetting about the actual technology. It's one thing to talk about how cool it is to have sensors on all the troughs and dams, and there's a satellite communication units and solar panels and all these other things. The actual technology is irrelevant. It's the fact that, wouldn't it be cool if we just knew what the levels of water in all the tanks were, and we were alerted to a leak. And so anyone from any generation can have that discussion around, well, what's the value of that? At the moment, we spend a week driving around measuring those things or observing those things. If we had a system that just told us those things, what's that worth? And that also becomes that important decision to be having with the banks. It's all around, how are you changing your management decision? How is your business becoming better? It really doesn't matter how many shiny, flashy things you have. It's what's the information that's being generated, how are you using it, and what's its return? Again, that's one of the biggest shortcomings we have in the ag tech space, is really robust return on investment type analysis. And so that's what there's a lot of university activity across the country looking at, how do we generate those numbers.
really interesting point too, because are banks willing to invest in a farmer's digital solution if it does require extensive capital? Are banks set up to understand that ROI when it comes to something that may be more on the cutting edge, and then I suppose versus that something that's already been out there? John, is that something that you've seen or problems that farmers have had justifying investments?
Well, I think, again, it just comes back to how you've done your return on investment. And so that's where you need to have a robust, agronomic or, farm business assessment of, what's it going to cost? What's it going to return? It's one of those frustrations that so much of the corporate ag world seems quite happy at adopting a lot of these technologies because they do just come at it from an accounting perspective. What does it cost? What does it return? That makes sense. Let's do it. If we try and avoid that, then that's where we start following the shiny things and heading down the track of doing things because they're interesting. As James said, that is actually a component to these things. Drones are terrific. They're really good fun, but they don't necessarily actually do anything. And so if you accept that as part of their discussion, then that's part of your decision-making process.
And Bruce, you've flagged a couple of times, I suppose, that investment in your tech solutions and trying to find those partners. Is that a problem? Is Australia well equipped to investing in digital solutions, either from a government or venture capitalist point of view?
Let me think about that. No.
And why is that?
Look, and it's unfair to characterize Australia. We're very good adopters of technology,
yep.
But we're not good developers of technology. And our founders are currently domiciled in North America because that's where the interest is. But we'll continue to focus on the Australian market, because I think it's important we do so. When you're in a business that is innovating and creating new stuff, every business has pivoted at least once, twice, 3 times or more from the first idea they had to what they're actually producing for the market. And the only way that you can pivot is to get feedback. You're going to continue to go down the path of your idea, and be, almost tunnel visioned about that. But if the market doesn't want to buy it, then you've got to think about how you can apply the fundamentals or the base or some derivative of the base to a useful application in the marketplace. And I guess, without being directly involved in agribusiness, and please excuse me if I get this slightly wrong, but it's still a very disaggregated industry as far as I know. I know that there is consolidation in the industry, but it's still very much a disaggregated, business sector. And therefore, being able to consolidate views and ideas across the sector can sometimes be difficult. And I guess that's why forums like this are really important, where people can come together and start to share those ideas and shape the way that technology is actually going to solve it. We've all said it, the problem that they're actually facing, rather than the solution that somebody's thought up in a dark room or their garage. So it's about getting a real engagement between the use case, which is where the value is going to be derived, versus the provider whose focus is on profit and investment. And it's the nexus of those two things that will create a successful business going forward.
Can I just add to that, Bruce, is that the other thing that I think ag tech has suffered from is that too often ag tech providers have seen their solution as being the only solution, that their one thing is all that's needed. And whether it's a satellite service or something that you put on the tractor, technology being promoted is with this one piece of information, you'll now have all your problems solved and everyone will be happy. The reality is agriculture is a biological system that's incredibly complex, that actually requires dozens of different pieces of information. And so I think that's one of the more exciting aspects of the future, is how do we take information from all of these different systems and bring them together to have a much more integrated system that actually takes account of climate and finance and human resources and landscape and all these different components. Because just because you've got a spectacularly accurate map of how much nitrogen varies across your paddock doesn't mean you're actually any better positioned to make a nitrogen recommendation, because there are so many other factors there. And I think some of the ag tech world is starting to recognise that simply being part of a solution is where most of these technologies fit, and they're not the solution by themselves.
Yeah, and maybe if I can just jump in there as well. One of the driving forces is this information versus intelligence, and we're overloaded with information, and it actually is an impediment to moving forward, because we've got to spend so much time attempting to interpret or validate data that's useful for us. And one of the things at Floodmap, they've moved away from being a totally science-based predictive modeling tool to being a data-driven intelligence tool. And I think the quick example of that is the Bureau of Meteorology, and I'm not here to cast aspersions on the Bureau, they do great work, but you get a map of an event and it covers half of Queensland. What the hell does that mean for me, for my property, my house, my business, whatever? And and what we've done is we're taking literally hundreds of thousands of data points and converting those into maps that move down to a hyperlocal level. So if you've got an asset, you can determine how a flood's going to impact the asset. If you've got a property or a whole industry, you can look at how a flood impacted that industry at scale. So I think what we're trying to do is convert that masses of information into an intelligence tool that can be useful. And going back to my previous point, with engagement from the industry, we can actually start to really fine tune that and get it to an even greater value proposition for the people who are potentially going to use it.
Thanks, Bruce. And I just want to remind our listeners, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A button down the bottom there. So it's next to your chat one, if you've got any questions coming through. One last one from me before we jump into questions. We often talk about the role of farmers in tech and the proponents that are developing this. But the third one, I suppose, is the role of government. There's been a few conversations and points made there about people dropping out from this call due to their connectivity delays, and also, I suppose, the implications that that has upon choosing and adopting. But what is the role of government? Is it to invest in education and to support growers and farmers in making that decision? Or is there a greater need in that investment in terms of the digital infrastructure that surrounds this space? Who wants to tackle it?
I'll go first. I think absolutely yes. We were lucky enough at Floodmap to secure grant funding and to secure funding to market and what have you. And that's fantastic. But until somebody starts using the product, it's not going to develop to the extent that is possible. And government proves to be very reluctant and very risk averse in the actual adopting new technologies. So if you take us for an example, if the government were to adopt Floodmap, and it's principally designed at the moment for a disaster and emergency management context, but if we are Australia-wide, then the cost for individuals and the cost for small business to take advantage of that initial investment would be significantly reduced. So, the advantage then is that there is a nationwide view of a particular risk, in this case, flood, and all the participants can actually mitigate their risk. They can plan for that risk. They can respond. I had a call in the recent floods from a business owner that had $500,000 worth of stock in a storeroom, and council said, no, it's going to be fine. The next morning, there was 1.5 meters of water and they lost all of their stock. I could have told them that night that they were going to flood the next morning. And they said 6 hours is all we needed to be able to mitigate the, So you multiply that across multiple business in multiple sectors, and it pays for itself. It honestly does. So it's around people having, and governments in particular, having the vision to invest in foundational technologies that then can become ubiquitous and applied to multiple use cases.
Thanks, Bruce. James or John, any comments on government's role?
Amelia, I think government's, the last resort and should get out of the road of commerce. But in, particular cases like Bruce and, where you've got these data sets that are just so impactful and so unique, and, it'd be very hard for a government agency to replicate. And then I've just found that, with government, they tend to be extremely risk adverse. So, we were pitching in the future drought fund for a platform, to provide. But but one of the senior people in the future drought fund said that, no one's ever been sacked by engaging a top four firm, so whether it be like the likes of one of those top four, but they have for boutique firms, and founding firms. So unless we can address that somehow, Bruce, unless there's a collective like there is, forming in the Australian landscape in terms of ag tech sort of society, it's going to be very hard for us to lobby. And in terms of a lot of people on this call, leadership is required there, because I'd probably suggest that the government is expending a lot of money that they don't need to, because there's some amazing digital solutions out there that have got the wherewithal to address some of these massive problems, but their only route to I suppose survival is through enterprise and commercial means. But I do think government has a place to play to actually accelerate some of these businesses through the networks that the government has and the agencies that government has, instead of just defaulting to a top four firm that most of these founders have fallen out of anyway.
Yeah.
Any thoughts from you, John?
Just adding that I think there's also the role that government can potentially play in facilitating knowledge and awareness amongst the industry. So it's playing that support role for farming groups and farmer organisations to actually start this whole process of digital literacy. How are we going to deal with that? Because until the producers are more comfortable and familiar with some of the technologies and concepts, it makes it really difficult for them to evaluate any one technology over another. So I think there's, as James and Bruce have said, governments can be reluctant to get involved in some of these, anything that might be seen as promoting a particular technology, but they do seem to be more open to helping producers to make decisions and those sorts of things. So training activities, awareness campaigns, those sorts of things are the sorts of things that might be a first step, as part of an industry leadership to say we need more of that. How are we going to get that happen while we're trying to deal with those bigger issues of getting government support for some of that foundational work?
Thanks, John. And I suppose we're approaching the end of the hour, so we'll go head over to questions. And thank you for the robust discussion and questions through the chat function there that I'm trying to keep up whilst listening. So there's some fabulous points being made there. One, I suppose, is from Graham Crook, I think, when I scroll back. Should all data be available in an open and transparent forum? With so much data coming in on a daily basis, there needs to be a filter method that producers can use to get relevant information from business decision for business decision making. Should it be open? Should it be transparent? Should it be available? John?
I think absolutely not. Like what are we asking every business in the countryside to put all their information on a website where we can just troll through it? I think that will be a crazy proposition. Traditionally, farmers have been burnt by making their data available to researchers and tech companies who then take that information, develop something really neat, and the first thing they want to do is sell it back to the producers. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a mechanism for producers having their data stored somewhere that's centrally organised, that's completely secure and robust, where a farmer, a producer, if they're willing to make their data available on the basis that they're going to share in some of the profits of something that might be developed from it, then those sorts of platforms I think are potentially where some of these things go. I also think it's a role that some of the universities could actually start playing, is that the university could be a trusted host for data, because they're not actually trying to then sell a product back to the producer or to on-sell the data. They could essentially house the large databases. And ultimately, because of the complexity of these biological systems, we actually need to have really, really large data sets to be able to develop some of these decision support tools and things. And so I think the idea of having the data together is almost essential. It's critical, but just making it freely available, I don't see why farmers should make their data freely available if dentists and accountants and the local motor mechanic aren't doing the same thing.
James.
I tend to agree with John. I think if they're gaining value out of it, like sort of benchmarking and they can sort of change their business because of it, and there's some programs, and particularly we'd like to aggregate anonymized data and aggregate it so that we can get a bit more of a view on industry and particular regions and areas, and then inform better decision making. So so that a particular farm can sense where their deficiencies are and where they can improve on. I think in terms of the history of data, farmers in Australia have got access to things freely through the DPI and through ABS and Bureau of Meteorology and things like that. So there is a bit of a reluctance to pay for anything, if that was the nature of the question. But I do think that that's the value proposition that the business has to put forward, to attract usage from farmers. I just think that I just think that it's such an exciting phase that we're going through, whereby when I first left school, somebody said, wouldn't it be great if you could sit on the beach and see if you had any leaks on your farm? Well, you can do that now. We're moving so rapidly. It's just amazing. It'll be incredible to see where we are, in the blink of an eye, to tell you the truth. So in terms of data, I think if you wanted to improve your own business, and there's a financial gain, you should really pay for it. And just be aware of where your data is going with the current programs.
Bruce, any words from you?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I agree wholeheartedly with John. It shouldn't be either a commercial or personal impost on any individual. But for me, information is the only asset that grows in value when you give it away for free. And the more access to data we have, the better solutions can look. And a very quick example is we were able to access data from a commercial client in a rural setting that had very high resolution digital elevation mapping over their assets. But we were then able to reuse that data for a local community to be able to get very fine granularity about how a flood was going to affect individual properties in a township. So it's a very small example, but it's that reuse and repurposing of data, and then the aggregation of data from multiple sources that can really start to find solutions that we don't even know at the moment exist.
Thank you. And we've got a number of questions coming through, so we'll try and answer one more. And apologies, and thank you for everyone for asking those. The question here, can you describe what banks can do more to support ag tech? We've talked about, obviously, government and their role, but what's the role of the banking sector? Bruce.
Role of the banking sector is to understand risk. If ag tech is mitigating risk or has the potential to mitigate risk, then I think that financial institutions, the capital should follow the benefit. And if it proves to be non-beneficial, I don't think in aggregate they've lost much. But I think there's a real need to start to take a much more risk profile view of future technologies and how they can make significant positive impacts on both the individual business as well as the financial institution that's providing the capital. So I think it's really understanding and looking to mitigate risk in the longer term.
Can I just add to that is that I think one of the things we haven't had a chance to talk about so far is where we're going to with carbon and a net carbon or net zero carbon position. And I think banks are increasingly going to play a role there, where farmers that are able to demonstrate that they have a sustainable management program will be able to attract better interest rates or have access to wider insurance policies, those sorts of things. I think that's a whole program of work that's not too far off being commercially available, and that technology is going to be critical in achieving that zero carbon outcome.
Thanks, John. And yes, we haven't touched on carbon, which seems to be a white elephant in the room, certainly. James?
Yeah, certainly. I think the banks have got they're extremely trusted in the in the advisory sort of space for farmers. So I think it's knowledge transfer. So if their best customers, adopting technologies, what are they? And in their sort of reports and emails, they can just have sort of an awareness of what's happening across their portfolios. I think that would add value, but yeah, certainly. I mean, there's going to be a regulatory sort of push in terms of systems and the characteristics of those systems, and particularly natural capital and carbon. So the banks will be looking to account for that somehow, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens anyway.
And apologies, we haven't got to everyone's questions. There is one here that I can see you madly typing away to, John, so you might want to answer it, which is, do you see the value in harmonising agri-tech data or agri-data through the use of standards both here and internationally?
Yes, and that really is going to be an essential component in the short term, because by identifying standards, and it really doesn't matter where the standards come from, if we can have some standards, and it makes sharing data easier, makes benchmarking, all those sorts of things easier. Big data analysis requires lots and lots of farmers to be contributing, so having those standards is going to be there. And ultimately, I think that's the most exciting component on the horizon, is the integration of data, that we're getting away from using silver or looking for silver bullets to say, well, no, it takes 100 solutions out there to answer a problem comprehensively.
I'll give, I suppose, a plug to NFF and their data code, as I suppose starting a lot of that conversation as well. I suppose I'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much, John, Bruce, and James, for your time. And thank you for our fabulous listeners for giving up your lunchtime. I'm going to hand over to Philippa to give a bit of a wrap up.
Great. Thanks, Amelia, and thanks to all our panelists. I think what's clear is that all the ag tech in the world still needs good conversations and good engagement around it. It requires risk takers and early adopters, and that feedback loop's really important. And within all of that, it is good leadership that's required. So I'd like to thank our panelists for the leadership that they're playing in the space. Disruption's important and really positive in our system, and the work you're doing is valued. So thank you for your conversation today. Thank you, Amelia, for your contribution and being the glue that held that conversation together. And for all of you joining today, we certainly recognise the role that each of you play in your communities, industries and on farm. As you leave today's session, there will be a survey. We're certainly very keen to hear your feedback about what you'd like to see in the future, and also any further questions or comments about today's webinar. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel. You can search the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation, and you'll also tomorrow receive a link to the webinar. A plug for our next webinar on Thursday, 12 May at midday. The topic, resilience practices, practical tips to building drought resilience from the community to the farm. You can register in the link that's just been shared in the chat, and certainly via our website. The Australian Rural Leadership Foundation is really proud of its work alongside the department and the Future Drought Fund. We're really excited to be collaborating with all of our partners and the fund as we look to support drought resilience for our regions and communities now and into the future. Thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you on 12 May.